happy to welcome you to Our Lady of Corpus Christi for a discussion with Dr. Ronda Chervin about St. Teresa of Avila's interior castle. A lot of you know Ronda Chervin from her regular appearances on EWTN. What you don't know maybe about Ronda is that she's a widow and a grandmother. She's also a visiting professor here at Our Lady of Corpus Christi of both philosophy and theology. Ronda also has many books she's published over the years, and those books are all available. I think at least the titles of those books are available at her website, rondachervin.com. Ronda, we're very happy to have you here. I listened to your discussions and teachings on Teresa of Avila's interior castle with great intensity and prayerfulness to prepare for this little time we have together to discuss it.
Yes.
So, Ronda, if you don't mind, I want to jump right into what you taught us. And if you remember, looking at Ronda's work, she did first a half-hour section on a biography of St. Teresa, and then we spent another half hour on the interior castle and the 7 mansions. So we like to be a bit spontaneous around here. We like to have some formality, but have a lot of room for spontaneity. So we're not exactly sure where this conversation is going to take us, but we trust in God's grace it's going to all be good. So, Ronda, I'd like to, though, start with something you mentioned personally about Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, her spiritual mentor. You said both of them come from a converso background. Both of them had Jewish roots, and that there's hints of Jewish mysticism in their writings. Well, you yourself being a Jewish convert, I'm sure that means a lot to you. So could you just spend a little time just going over that again with us?
Yes. Well, you have to really go back. Some people are always thinking, well, you know, the Jews rejected Jesus. Now, it's true that the hope of Jesus was that everyone would be all his people would be his followers, but it still remains the fact that the early, Jesus himself, Mary, John the Baptist, all the early apostles, and most of the followers of Jesus were Jews who saw in Jesus their Messiah, the promised Messiah. Now, Judaism didn't just disappear, contrary to many people's expectations. It continued, and because they didn't have the temple, because the temple was destroyed by
well, 70
that big
AD.
war, 70 AD. Okay, the temple was destroyed. So then it became more rabbinical, where instead of having priests offering the sacrifices, you had rabbis teaching the moral teachings and the law to the people. Some of these rabbis were very legalistic, but others had mystical gifts, and you see this developed in the history of Judaism post-Christianity, these mystical gifts. Well, you see it in David's Psalms. David's Psalms are rapturous, you know. They're so personal and so much the living God. They're certainly not legalistic, which is why the Church uses the Psalms in her liturgy all the time. So there was particularly what influenced the families of people like Teresa and John would have been the Jewish mysticism in Spain. And some of this was very, some of this had a demonic cast to it, but others was pure and very beautiful.
Such as the Kabbalah that you're referring to? Or
well,
elements of that?
There's elements of that are good and elements that are bad.
Okay.
But since most people can't sort through that, it's very dangerous to read those kind of books. But anyhow, so it's surmised that in some way, whether consciously or unconsciously, that mysticism would have been around in the air, you know.
So mysticism doesn't begin with the Catholic Church. Mysticism has a deep roots all the way back to ancient Judaism.
Oh, sure.
And so in this writing of Teresa, we're not just finding something new, we're finding something deeply entrenched and rooted in the Church's tradition all the way back to ancient Judaism.
Yes, well, if you look at the Psalms, you have David saying, "What else do I want but you? Yeah. Only you." That's like God alone. Of Teresa, God alone suffices.
The Song of Solomon would be the other, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Well, they were very familiar with the Song of Songs. And the Jewish commentators always interpreted the Song of Songs as an allegory about the love of God for his people.
Well, that's beautiful. That lets us know that, you know, this idea of Teresa, I personally think she's one of the the deeper spiritual masters I've ever read. I mean, I've read many of them. Her work and John of the Cross was a special challenge to me to understand, and of course to try to live. And now I understand a little bit more why. It's really deeply entrenched way back into our Jewish mysticism. I don't think many people realize that. Thanks, Rhonda.
Uh-huh.
But there are some other questions that are more apropos to our current time. That takes us back. Let's come forward with her a little bit. She was writing in the 16th century. She was a Carmelite nun. She was in the convent and writing for contemplative nuns, as I understand.
Yes.
But yet, this is one of the greatest books on Kolbe's shelves, and we want everyone to read this. So, did we make a mistake, or is this really for everyone, or was it limited to nuns, or how does it apply to lay people, for example, in the 21st century, or does it not?
Well, of course, this is the whole premise of studying the greatest books. A great book is a book that's transcended its own culture to reach out to the human person in the universal features of humanity. Mm-hmm. So certainly we don't say, well, how could Plato have anything to say to us today? Mm-hmm. You know? So in the same way, these spiritual writers, see, there are certain, okay, let's put it this way. You can read books of people who are intent in helping busy lay people working in the house or in the office or in engineering or plumbing, how to find God in their daily prayer life by talking to Him all day long, mm-hmm. asking Him to help us. A phrase that I came up with recently in this connection was, why would you want to do anything without Him? You know, we say, well, I said my morning offering and now I'm going to go about my day. Mm-hmm. Well, why wouldn't you want Him to be with you during your day? Mm-hmm. Our beloved Sister Faustina, who's such a tremendous figure for the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, Jesus upbraided her once. He said, you don't talk to me enough. And she said, well, I have all these boring things to do. I'm just eating dinner. Talk to me about eating dinner. You know, so you could talk. So there are these books that tell you in your busy life how to reach out to Jesus and dialogue with Him. Mm-hmm. But Teresa had all of that, but she also had this deep contemplative union where instead of bringing Jesus, so to speak, into her world, mm-hmm. she would be taken into His world, see? But we all need this, if not all day long. Most of us are not called to be full-time contemplatives, but if we don't have that contemplative time in our day with Him, even if it's just 10 minutes, mm-hmm. if we never stop, then it's like our world is the center and He's just a little corner, mm-hmm. see, but He's the center, mm-hmm. and our little world is supposed to be flowing from Him. Our virtues are supposed to be flowing out into that world, see. Mm-hmm. So that's part of what she can teach you, is how to get out of your compulsive agenda into His world long enough so that He can get hold of you. Yes. And start forming you. I liken it to the insights of marriage encounter was that the couple, after they have children, they get very busy. They could reach a point where all they're doing is the necessities to keep life going, and they never talk to each other anymore. So unless they're willing to stop and spend at least 20 minutes a day mm-hmm. just being close to each other, mm-hmm. their marriage is going to go down the drain. Right. So it's like that. So we can't become brides of Christ if our whole attention is on the necessities of life mm-hmm. okay. and our work for Him, our apostolate, say, but never this deep I-thou contact, see?
We have to have this deep contact with the Lord. He wants this constant relationship with us, even in the trivial things, as you just said. But I'm thinking, though, along the lines of, in the same century, in the Counter-Reformation, there was another saint, St. Francis de Sales, and he wrote another spiritual classic. He's also a spiritual master the introduction to the devout life. It's an introduction that he wrote primarily for laity as a diocesan priest. He wasn't in the Carmel. He wasn't behind walls. He was in the community, and he was dealing with laity, and he wrote a book for them. That, coupled with the idea, we've had a pastoral council here at Vatican II, and in many ways a pastoral council, and the whole movement towards the philosophy of personalism and experience in the world. We're living in a different time. It's the modern world. And so, as you said, Teresa is perennial. We're to read these ideas, but is her spirituality really in tune with the times, or does it need itself an aggiornamento, or is it apropos the way that it is?
Oh, well, of course, what you have is contemporary spiritual writers, such as myself, taking these works of the saints and relating them to daily life. So just this thing we were just talking about is if you don't have 10 minutes a day, or I like to say, assuming you could get to Mass. Now, many people can't, but a lot of people can. I was at a funeral, and someone said, well, about this Knight of Columbus who had died. They said, well, after he could no longer play golf, he started coming to daily Mass. So I thought it was a very funny statement, because obviously he could have played golf later and gone to daily Mass if he wanted
were a
to.
little mixed up.
So somehow, if we can't spare the time to let Jesus come into us in his real presence, the greatest real presence, it says in the Catechism of the Catholic Church in Vatican II, is the Eucharist. Yes. So if we don't, he's like, in my mind, sort of leaping down from heaven to come right into my body.
Yes.
And that's such a love act. And I say, well, I'm too busy. Well, what is so much more important? See, so unless how we would relate her insights to contemporary life is we have this incredible busyness, but people are doing all these busy things to service their idols, in a sense. In order to have a perfect house, they have to, I know people who clean the house twice a day. You know, well, that's necessary if you have many little young children, but even after the young children are gone, there's a kind of, you know, we make something that you could see, what do people give the time priority to?
Yes, there's too much time spent on things that aren't necessary, but time with the Lord is necessary for spiritual life. So here you're saying we might not be able to be contemplatives in a convent or in a monastery, but all of us can find time to be with the Lord at some point during the day, and there are other things we could give up to make that happen. And I'm thinking along the lines of, I asked the question not to suggest that Teresa is not apropos to the modern world.
Yeah, you want to see what I would say.
Yeah, because I think she is. I mean, she's on the greatest bookshelf.
What I find when I read these mystical saints is, even though I'm not where they are spiritually yet, it gives me a goal. It's a horizon. So otherwise we could get into this mood, well, I'm all right, I don't commit mortal sins anymore. You know, my venial sins he understands. Sometimes I have to tell some lies to get through life. It makes things easier. Teresa insists on this, that even in the seventh mansion you could be committing venial sins. So there's this huge struggle with that. And so if you're not aiming for holiness, and you're sort of saying, well, I'm just going to sneak into heaven someday, I hope, then what are your goals? What are those other goals? Things like, I've got to succeed. Or one of the things that this would be applicable to, you know, to life today. I see so many post-middle-aged men who feel like failures because I never got the yacht, or I never got the Cadillac, or all this kind of stuff. Even though they're daily Mass Catholics, they feel like failures. So then, instead of measuring themselves on how did I love God and neighbor today, I love to see retired men who have all these, so some women do too, but I mean this men particularly because of this failure thing. They go out and do Vincent de Paul, they help in the community, they do all these works because they have these administrative skills from their previous job experience for free. And then they don't feel like failures because they're measuring their day by how much did I help someone. So all this is relevant to Teresa because these same people are sitting in adoration. They commit themselves to praying before the Blessed Eucharist in their churches or to daily Mass. And they're there repenting for their previous sins of their whole life. And asking for the strength to overcome the problems of working on teams in the parish to help make things work. And it's a beautiful thing.
That's it. I had lunch recently with the past president of the World Apostolate of Fatima, and during lunch he simply asked me, David, do you know what's the most important part of the message of Fatima? Well, I knew that he knew, so I wasn't going to answer. I simply asked him, well, what is it, Father? And he said, well, it's the sanctification of one's daily duties. What you were just talking about. A very busy person active in the world could sanctify that time by offering it to God as a type of prayer, right? So there's something mystical even in that.
Well, also letting Him come in. It's not just making the offering, but when you say, okay, if this project isn't your will, or purify this for professors, purify, let me come into this class and let me not say anything that isn't your will. And I used to stun the students sometimes by I'd stop the class if it was getting stale, dull, something or other. And I'd say, well, we had an opening prayer, but let's say another prayer now because this thing that's come up is obviously touchy. It's pushing people's buttons. Let's pray again for the Holy Spirit to help us. See, that's not just making an offering, but it's saying, I can't do this as well as you would want it to be done. Or say parents with families, instead of just saying, well, these kids are out of hand, I'm going to slug them and they'll shape up. Say, really praying for the gift of counsel to see how to help this kid this moment. Now, you still have failures, of course, in anything we do. We're not perfect. But at least our intention wouldn't be to just follow my own bent because that's the easiest way to go.
Yeah, so it would be the sanctification of one's daily duty in communion with God, realizing my littleness and the need for His grace, and speaking to Him throughout the whole process. Right? That's more of the ideal. Not enough just to this is for you, Lord, it's consecrated to you, but do I do it with you, not just for you?
Oh, good.
Right?
Very good.
That's what I hear you saying.
Yes, with Him. Because that's this mystical closeness, you see, and